Do you have favorite queries that you run regularly? Have you marked them as favorites using the My Favorite Queries feature? Now, the My Favorite Queries feature is a handy list when you're looking at Query Manager or Query Viewer, but you have to navigate to get there. Wouldn't it be nice to skip the navigation and launch them directly from a tile? Or even better, what if you could access them directly from the nav bar? Say, like this. Over the next several episodes, we're going to show you how. So be sure to subscribe as we don't want you to miss any of the details. Okay, let's start with the data. So I'm logged in as a developer user, and I need to add some queries to my favorite queries. So using the navigator, I will go to Reporting Tools, Query, and then Query Manager. Now, I happen to use the security queries a lot. So let's add a few of those. Let's see, View All. And let's go to plist roles. So see the permissionless roles, permissionless users. And from the roles, let's go to role users and role class. That'll be the permission list. And from the user's perspective, what roles does a user belong to and what permission lists provide that access to the user. And then at the top here, action, add to favorites. Okay, fantastic. So I can see that I have a list of favorites here. And I'm logged in as a developer user. So I can see that me, developer user, these are my favorite queries. Now I'm logged in as just a standard user over here, and I can see the standard user has a completely different list of favorite queries. So I think it's safe to assume that the favorite queries are keyed by Opera ID. Now I think the next question, the most important question is, where is this data stored? I mean, I'm going to assume that this data is stored in the database, that it is stored in a table because PeopleSoft is a metadata-driven application, and everything about PeopleSoft is stored in a database table. The question is, where? So we can start with a SQL trace and look through the selected records, but that really seems to me like looking for a needle in a haystack. So how about we do this? How about we dig through the component a bit and see what we find? So the component, Query Manager, I'll just cheat, I'll grab that from the URL and open the component, Query Manager, and we see that it has a lot of pages. And if we look here, we see that in the URL, it actually says we're looking at the query select page. So query select page, perfect, top one, hidden, view definition. And I'm just curious, what if we go to that grid, the My Favorite Queries grid? There it is, fantastic. What does it say is the default record for the main record? Query select work. Well, that's interesting. So main record, what is a main record? What's the value of a main record? From a component buffer's perspective, not much. You see, a component buffer has level 0, level 1, level 2, level 3, right? And each one of those levels, except level 0, levels 1 through 3, all have a primary record. Now, the primary record is not the main record. The primary record determines what rows are selected. Now, in a grid, you might have related display fields, and you might have derived work fields. Now, derived work fields don't exist at the database. They have no data. Derived work records don't determine how many rows render. The primary record determines how many rows render. This is not the primary record. It's a work record, and a work record may not be a primary record. So let's look at the order tab and see if we can figure out by looking at the grid itself which record is the primary record. Now, usually the primary record is the first non-derived work with the fields within a grid. The derived work record, the primary record is usually the field, the record associated with the field that is not a derived work field. The first one that's not a derived work field. We see here it is a dynamic view. What is a dynamic view? A dynamic view is SQL that's evaluated at runtime. That stands in contrast to a standard view, which is evaluated or compiled at design time. You create your view in Application Designer, and then you build the view. And any SQL, MetaSQL specifically, is evaluated at build time. whereas a dynamic view is never sent to the database. It's a SQL statement stored within PeopleSoft, sent to the database at runtime. So you can use MetaSQL in a dynamic view, and that MetaSQL, such as %operator ID, is resolved at runtime rather than design time. Key difference. But what I've seen is Oracle usually uses these dynamic views as a placeholder. Here, let's take a look. View definition, and let's look at the SQL. And we see that it says select rec name from PSRecDefn. No, that has absolutely nothing to do with my favorite queries, does it? Interesting. You know, the most common dynamic view that I see here is a comment dash dash placeholder, or it'll be something like select X from PS installation, knowing that it's only going to select one row if it ever selects any rows. Notice if it ever selects any rows, because I have a suspicion here. See, this has nothing to do with my favorite queries, and the number of records that exist within PSRecDefn has nothing to do with the number of favorite queries that I have. So I'm pretty confident if we look at this grid, we're going to see that PeopleSoft has no auto select selected. My favorite queries grid. Use tab. No auto select. What does that mean? That means that by default, PeopleSoft will render the My Favorite Queries grid with no data. The component processor will not load data into this grid. So instead, PeopleSoft is using PeopleCode to load this grid. You know, standard insert row and then set the fields themselves. Interesting. So here's an idea. What if we look at the PeopleCode and see if we can find out, if we can derive, if we can figure out what record stores my favorite queries? Now, usually with a dynamic view, we have PeopleCode that's going to load the rows. The question is, which event would we use to load those rows? Well, if we think about the event processing flowchart, we would have component pre-build. That's before data is loaded. We would have component post-build. In the middle there, we would have row init for each row that's loaded into the component buffer. Then we'd have PageActivate. So pre-build, I think that's out. That's before the data exists. That's before component buffer exists. So component post-build, that makes sense. So let's go back to the component and let's look at the component post-build PeopleCode to see if we can find this record. So view PeopleCode, and let's see, how many rows are here? How many lines of code? About 200 lines. That's reasonable. We can evaluate that. This code, a lot of it is just declarations. I don't see anything in here dealing with favorite queries. Okay, so maybe not this event. Now, the query manager has been around for a very long time, so I'm suspicious. I mean, the code could be in perhaps a row init of any of the level 0 records. Wow, there are a lot of them. Uh, what about if we were to look at the row init for the derived work record? That isn't going to do anything either because there's no data yet. So it's probably not going to be in here if we were to look at the field events. Yeah, sure enough, no, isn't going to be there. Okay, so I'm thinking, how about component? Oh, I've got another event. How about PageActivate? Interesting. View page PeopleCode. Okay, now, how many lines are here? About 100. Okay, good. That's reasonable. Oh, interesting. Do you notice the run to Excel? Notice the run to Excel visible. Interesting. So the run to Excel, the ability to run a query to Excel allows a user to download the query result set to their local workstation. In security, we call that data exfiltration. See, when the data is in the database, we're able to protect the data. But as soon as a user downloads that data, we can no longer control the data. So we might want to hide the download to Excel. And it appears that Oracle has provided that ability through permission lists. But we might want to perhaps have some different control, different granular control, different decisions. We might, for example, say that when somebody is connected to PeopleSoft through our corporate network, through VPN, for example, we allow them to download to Excel, but external remote access, maybe not.